Hey everyone, thanks for joining this afternoon. Going to give our speakers just a moment to get themselves unmuted and on camera. Scott,
Hello, good morning, good afternoon,
or good evening, depending where you're at.
wherever you are, absolutely.
Um, Perfect. We'll give David just a second and let a few others trickle in, and then we will dive in. Anyone who's joining, feel free to drop in the chat where you're located at. It's always kind of fun to see where everyone is. Hey, David.
Hey guys.
All right, I think we've got everybody, so we'll kick off. For those in the audience, thanks for joining today. We're going to have a really fun session, and I'm excited about this because when we talk about account hierarchies, there's such a strategic conversation around this as businesses look to move further up market into enterprise. When we think about ABX, ABM type expansion plays, but also the technical component of this. So I do think this is going to be such a well-rounded conversation for us, and I've got some great speakers today. Before we dive into the topic, just want to remind everybody, so those who joined via AirMeet or those on LinkedIn, please ask questions, right? So open dialogue, drop questions in the chat. We'd love to answer them. You've got two really strong experts here on the call, so pick their brain, right? That's what we're here for, and that's what this is all about. So make sure you're asking questions. I'll answer them kind of as they come in and ask them, and then we'll make sure to leave some time at the end as well. So perfect. So before we dive in, want to just have our speakers introduce themselves. So David, want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Molly. Yeah, my name is Dave Nelson. I'm the CEO of Traction Complete. And we really believe that data can be this incredible instruction set for businesses if it's done properly. And so we've been on a mission to help improve the lives of revenue operations folks, where we build automation software that helps reduce the complexity of data, particularly inside their Salesforce environment. We build software that helps link accounts together, clean up duplicates, assign records based on their go-to-market, facilitate building out territories, and then assigning and reassigning those when reps come and go, because we all have that struggle. But we were bred out of a Salesforce consulting company where we had a ton of repeat requests for this kind of functionality. And so we decided to productize them and take them to market on the Salesforce App Exchange. So yeah, lots of experience, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. And Scott?
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're from. Scott Ellsworth, I'm from Rochester, New York. I am the current head of business operations for Brightspeed. Brightspeed is the United States' 5th largest ILEC telephone company. Prior to that, I've spent the last 20 years inside of sales ops, the last 20 years suffering from all the things that Dave just mentioned, the struggles with making sure we understand who we're going after, making sure we're optimizing our resources, and trying to maximize our revenue. So it's an issue near and dear to my heart. It's an issue that day one as an intern in college, I was forced to grapple with, and here in my new role, continue to grapple with it. So really excited to be here today to have this conversation and to share some of the things we've learned.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for joining. So let's dive in, and Dave, I'm going to pass this one to you just to set the foundation. What is an account hierarchy, and why is it so challenging, right? What's bringing us to this conversation today, and how do we help set the stage and educate kind of the audience who maybe isn't as familiar?
Sure. Yeah, no, sounds good. Let's start at the beginning. Yeah, an account hierarchy is really just a group of accounts that make up an overall business. And usually it's an enterprise business that has grown either through diversifying itself or through mergers and acquisitions. And so an example would be like a Walt Disney, for instance. So everyone's heard of Disney. I think they started making cartoons, but they've grown into theme parks, Disney World, Disneyland. They own movie studios, Marvel and Pixar, et cetera. Some they grew themselves, some they purchased. And now it's just part of this major enterprise that are really important to companies because they tend to buy differently than single organizations. They influence each other into what they purchase. If someone really likes something, they'll tell others. They influence how they buy. They might have one joint procurement company or procurement team, sorry. And they may want or tell each other how much they're paying. And so they understand their pricing across whatever they're purchasing. And that becomes important then for any company selling into them, because you may need to react differently. You may need to provide one sales rep for the whole organization or preferred pricing. It certainly represents this opportunity to sell more into all of the other businesses that are part of this conglomerate. And so hopefully companies are taking advantage of that. But the big but here is that it represents this really complex problem where first you need to understand, hey, are these companies related? And then be able to take that information and match it to the data that you have in your Salesforce environment so that you can link those together, so that now you can instruct your team and change all of your territories and whatnot based on that understanding. And it's just not that easy because there's different naming conventions and whatnot, but there's also exceptions, right? There's holdings companies where you may not agree with the way they're owned. There's franchises that aren't owned by one another, but are really impacted by one each other. And then there's partial ownership, mergers and acquisitions, all sorts of these things. So it gets really, really complex. So yeah, I think it'll be a fun conversation here.
Awesome. And then, Scott, from your perspective, right, as a true practitioner and somebody who's probably dealt firsthand with this, how has this played into kind of your go-to-market strategy across the years?
Yeah, no, that great question, Molly. And as Dave was talking, there were two different spectrums that come to mind, and honestly, complete opposite. But they kind of get at the same goal. The first organization that I had the privilege of being a part of, they had a very large book of business, but as many companies do, had really complex systems. Had an aging or a unique way of handling their account hierarchy, and what that really ended up representing was not a complete single pane of glass, right? And so we embarked on a project on account hierarchies, and I'm a little fuzzy with the details because it's been so many years. But when you looked at the churn rate for accounts that were properly structured versus those that we identified as a mismatch, the churn on those that was a mismatch was 10x higher. And so we underwent an exercise to go through and to make sure that we could get all of the children accounts under in a hierarchy so that we could have that strategic conversation and we could talk about the entire solution. And not surprisingly, churn dramatically reduced. And so that was a really cool story. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, the last experience, and actually the experience where I had the opportunity to meet with Dave, it was more about optimizing sales and reducing our cost of coverage, right? We had an environment where I'm sure many of you do, right? Where anybody could kind of do whatever they wanted. And what that meant is that someone in New York could be calling on an account in Florida, even though that account in Florida already might be a customer. And that's not optimal. And it also meant that your people were not focused on the right type of accounts and have visibility to all the firmographic data about it, right? And so we were able to reduce costs and we were able to grow revenue. Where in the opposite, the first example, right, it was about churn. So account hierarchies, to me, it's geeky, but it's exciting, right? Because it really does hit all of the different operational areas that as practitioners we care about.
No, absolutely. And we had a good question come in. Just curious to learn about suggestions and best practices for unique account identifiers, right? And I think that is such a, as we think about, bringing in this external data and then being able to organize it, how have you guys worked through really building that connection the right way?
So Dave, if you don't mind, let me start, and then
Yeah,
I love your opinion, right? So Fabian, great question. Let me first say that it is always a process, right? I would love to be able to hand a full book of business over and say, here, give me DUNS numbers, or here, codify all of this data. The first thing I would tell you is if a company comes back and says, I've matched 100% of your records, I'd be nervous because they can, but it's not necessarily accurate, right? So in selecting whatever company you select with, right? Some of them are better than others, and depending on whether you're just domestic, whether you're international, whether you're large, whether you're small. You want to make sure that the matches you have are truly positive matches, because it's the false positives that can be just as detrimental to not having that data at all. And so it is a continuous effort, and should always be a continuous effort. However, that being said, Fabian, it drives me absolutely bonkers when we don't have that, because there's such power in having a unique identifier such as a DUNS number that allows you to put that in. And Dave, I know you've worked with a variety of different customers in a variety of different industries, right? And I think having that identifier is kind of the basis, right?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, it's really important for a couple of reasons. One, you have your first party data, right? What records do you have, in this case, your Salesforce environment? And then being able to match that to a third party data set, like a Dun & Bradstreet. Fabian, you mentioned D&B there. So trying to match that to their DUNS number. But then you also have your downstream systems, right? You have your ERP environment, or whatever it may be, your data lake or data warehouse, or MDM, where you need to then map your first party data that's probably enriched with the third party, so enriched with D&B, to the MDM records and downstream. And so it can be very, very helpful, right, to have that unique ID to do all of that matching set. And there's complexities there that we'll probably get into through the conversation here.
Yeah, and you know what, Dave, the one thing that I think is worth mentioning is whatever solution you have, you need to be able to build in the uniquenesses that exist at your own company, right? Whether it is, hey, I wasn't able to identify this, but I want to group these together, right? Having a mechanism for that. Or, hey, this is grouped together, but you know what? That's not how we go to market, right? There's something always unique with every company. And at certain companies, especially the holding companies, right? A lot of people don't go after Berkshire Hathaway, right? They go after Geico and then Benjamin Moore Paints, right? Because they're very different industries. But in other cases, you always go to the top of the hierarchy, right? So you got to make sure as you're doing this to think about how can you create a construct or an architecture that allows you to have the uniquenesses that your business has, but also to recognize that data is never perfect, and that you need to be able to make changes when you discover something, and it won't always match what a third party says.
Exactly. I totally agree. And that's a perfect example. The holdings company situation is almost always where things break down. Others can be franchise and whatnot, but that you want that unique ID. So DUNS is incredible, right? The Dun & Bradstreet's done a great job of probably being the leader in hierarchy data. So which companies are related to whom. And even that can break down where you disagree with how you're going to market. So in that case, the Geico situation Scott just said, you may need to give a separate ID for that hierarchy than the global ultimate DUNS, because now you're kind of disagreeing that you should go after Berkshire, or that usually it falls into a territory. So that territory, someone's territory may own Geico and all its subsidiaries versus someone else owning Duracell or BHSF Railway or BNSF Railway, and all the other companies that Berkshire owns, where now you kind of need another unique ID. But the idea is that you have some unique ID that then you can proliferate throughout your systems, so that you have a clean understanding across everywhere which companies you're talking about. And that ideally you start with something like a DUNS, because it gives you a major leg up in the hundreds of thousands or millions of records that you may have.
So if we take a couple steps back here, because I think this is a great conversation and want people thinking about, when is the right time to like start evaluating hierarchies, right? So like we've got in the meat and potatoes, and we'll get back to that.
Yeah, I was gonna say we dove right into the deep
yeah,
end there.
which is great, right? I love it. But like for those, like, how do I know that like this is the right business decision that we should be making, right? What are some of the signals or the pain points or like the opportunities? Scott, you brought up, just looking at churn and those components, like what helped kind of lead to that?
Yeah, so great question. And you know what? I've had it in a couple of different situations. We've had a couple of instances where mergers and acquisitions or divestitures really became an impetus, right? Hey, we have this new organization, or it could even be a reorg or a restructure. We have this new organization. We got to figure out who we are and what we're doing, right? And how do we get all these disparate groups of people to talk and to work collaboratively, right? Like that has been an absolute driving force in a number of the instances that I've been in. The second driving force, and probably my favorite, was voice of the sales reps and or voice of the business, right? Depending on who's using it. And so, in one of my experiences, it was the sales reps constant noise to the CEO that really gave us the ammunition to start the effort, right? And it's because so much of their time was spent on infighting, or so much of their time was spent traveling all over the country, or so much of service delivery's time was spent trying to find all the records, right? And so I'm guessing for many of these people on the phone, they're nodding their heads, and those are all situations. And the best advice I could give at is it's never too early and it's never too late. It's once you start to hear some of those things, that it's really time. Now, Dave, you've worked with hundreds of customers. What have you heard? Is some of the more unique instances of, hey, it's time.
Yeah, well, first I'll start with kind of the generic, and then I'll get into the unique. I would say any companies that are selling into enterprise businesses most likely will care about a hierarchy. They'll care about not just making sure that the records that they have in their environment are correct, but also seeing, hey, what else is out there? What haven't I sold into that are part of this business so I can expand? And particularly for anyone who's selling into the branch locations, right? That's going to be immensely important, because now you need to know every single location of a business. Where selling software, the individual location, the branch location may not matter because you're selling in the headquarters, but it can be still very impactful for when they have separate businesses, particularly separate names. So I'd say those are the types of situations where they're important. And then, of course, like Scott said, the rubber meets the road when you're running into account conflicts. You have reps selling into the same overall business, but not finding out until it's too late. And yeah, we've heard it over and over again where these companies didn't recognize that two businesses were part of the same company, or maybe they did, but they had sales reps in different countries, right? So over in EMEA, selling into business that's headquartered in the US, or vice versa. And that's really where conflicts start to arise. But opportunities also present themselves, because if you've sold into North America, even if you have multiple sales reps, you may want those sales reps collaborating together, because the ones in EMEA now want to know what was sold to the US and vice versa, so they can take that story and shop it to the company that's over in Europe.
Dave, you want to know what's another unique scenario, and it's actually one that I'm facing today. In a lot of instances, understanding the account hierarchy, right, gives you additional people to go after and to go talk to. On the complete opposite spectrum, there are some companies, such as the one I'm with, right, where there's a confined geographical footprint. So understanding how much of the full company is inside of a defined footprint versus their total footprint, right, can kind of give you a sense of, hey, are they going to be a good play for us or not? Right. And there again, understanding that hierarchy and understanding that third party data really becomes powerful in terms of what is the right target market to go after and to go challenge.
Yeah, just setting TAM, setting territories, right? Like, we're doing this, to your point, Scott, you talked about, sales asking for this, but how do you use this to just build a better sales infrastructure and sales organization from an operational perspective?
Totally.
Yeah, no, absolutely, right. And trying to put parameters, right? When you get into a mature organization, right? Typically they're segmenting the business. Typically they're using industry or business size, and all of that, right? You need to be able to put it all together so that you can figure out how to create optimal sales territories, and when you have optimal sales territories, that's when you maximize growth and churn reduction.
Totally.
Absolutely.
I totally agree. I actually have an interesting example. So we ourselves, we're part of a hierarchy. So Traction on Demand was the parent company. They were the consulting business I mentioned before. Traction Complete was a product company. And then we had a few other product companies as well, Traction Guest and Traction Rec. And we all talked, right? So we all know exactly what the other companies are using, how they bought it, how much they paid for it. And we were always shocked by when we were licensing Outreach, let's say, and we know one of our other companies, actually, I think had Outreach first, but in another example, we knew how much others had paid. And we'd find we have a different sales rep. And that was just frustrating for us because then we had to go through the whole conversation start to finish. Whereas if we had had the same rep assigned to that territory, which should have been the same because we have the same location, that we could have just easily signed another purchase order and not had to go through the whole process. And now that we're actually kind of divested, we no longer have that strict ownership, but we still are affiliated. And that affiliation means we still talk, but not as much. And so that represents an opportunity for these sales organizations to say, hey, we've already sold into your sister company. Would you mind hopping on a call and we'll show you what they're using it for and why? Easy, right? Of course we will. Yeah, I want to know what they're doing, and I'll probably call them to find out from them too. But it just makes the lives easier and represents this great opportunity to sell more.
Oh, absolutely. And just using, as you have advocates, right, as the sales rep going in and saying, hey, would you make an introduction here? You're happy with our product. I mean, and it's again becomes a no-brainer, but one of the gaps, right, is like how do you build this in a way that makes it actionable? And that's kind of when we transition in, we know, Salesforce has an out of the box solution to do, record linking, parent account, child account. When does that not become good enough, right? When we think about manual versus like automated account hierarchies, and maybe explain what the difference is between those, Dave.
Yeah, you know what? I'll pass that one over to Scott.
Or Scott.
I can speak intimately about it, but Scott's been through it, right? So he knows the pain.
No, the great question, Dave. Salesforce does have a lot of power behind it, and it all depends on how you're set up, but it also depends on the governance that you've set up, right? And so what we found, and actually it goes back to Fabian's question, right? One of the first steps we did was to Duns code our base, right? And to understand what those different relationships were. And again, the power of having that together was visibility. And so what we found was the native Salesforce functionality you could use if you're disciplined and if you're governed. But more importantly, when you're using a tool that has these hierarchies, it gives you visibility across the enterprise. So while I might have a Salesforce account structure over here, I might also have one over here. And to be able to see that those two are related, as Dave just said, is really, really powerful. And that then allows you to see the cross-sell and upsell opportunities. And so that's where we found the real value is you can still absolutely and should absolutely use some of the native Salesforce functionality to group things, but it's getting visibility into that that then and making it actionable that is really powerful. We had an opportunity when we launched the account hierarchies to go and do a roadshow, and we can talk about that later. But that was almost the biggest piece of feedback that we got was, hey, I knew we did business with this company, but I didn't realize that this company bought this company, and now I can go after it, right? Johnny here in New York might have a $200 customer with it. That's not great. Like let's move that under the master relationship. And so it really enabled us to have some of those conversations.
And so when you started with kind of like, taking the data first, right? So you took and brought the data in, started to understand the data as it related to your existing business. And then the next step, I think, was like, what are the business decisions that then you started to make? Because I think as you could visualize and see the business, so you started with the strategy, started with a need, then took the data, and then move to like, what are the business decisions that we're going to make on like how we're going to action off this? What were some of like those additional conversations?
No, that's a great question, Molly. So, one of the first things you have to answer is, what do you define an account as? And so we were operating in a version of Salesforce that had millions of records. And let me tell you, my friends in IT were not very happy. Friends at Salesforce were thrilled because you pay per record, but the IT friends and the sales folks, right, were miserable by it because they couldn't find anything. And so the very first step, Molly, is identifying, what do you want an account to be as, right? And from there, once you start to identify and apply third-party logic, you can start to group them, and that's when you then have the opportunity for consolidation, or using any type of even the native Salesforce functionality. What we ended up doing, right? We defined an account at the highest level, with the exception of holding companies in certain industries. From there, we were able to go from 5 to 6 million down to a couple 100,000. Let me tell you, that makes a very big impact on the user experience. Again, you've got to do it slow and methodical, right? You got to go through, make sure you've got the right accounts identified. It's linked to the right master. Again, the native Salesforce grouping is going to give you some intelligence on that, right? If you've got questionable matches. But one of the worst things you can do is to move too fast. And it's actually one of the things we're dealing with now, where you got a whole bunch of stuff that you're unsure of. And so you put a bunch of stuff together that isn't really related. And you know what? That doesn't provide any value to anybody. So yeah, again, figuring that out is the first step.
And then when you think about, the rules of engagement for the sales team, right? So how does this change impact our territories, how we are structured our sales team? Obviously you're using data to drive those decisions, but maybe some of the gotchas or the we didn't think about as you worked through this.
Yeah, no, great question. Again, defining those rules of engagement. Some organizations have rules of engagement. Some people say, hey, you know what, Inc. wins. And so that becomes an interesting business challenge, right? And it is iterative. To your point, one of the things, and many companies have it, right? An agent or a partner program. And so thinking through what are the rules of engagement there? Where can you sell? If you're defining an account at the highest level, if you've got a whole bunch of locations that they don't have business, well, is that fair game? Some organizations, the answer is yes. Some other organizations, the answer is no, right? And so that becomes the hardest part. What about if, again, a non-customer location under a big hierarchy calls into inside sales, right? Should they do a lead pass to the account enterprise rep? The enterprise team's going to say yes every day, right? The inside team's going to say, make the sale. And so, it might be that you decide to do a 50-50 split. Whoever gets the call, right, gets the sale, and then the other 50% goes to the accountant. There's a lot of different options that you have, and yes, be flexible, but you can't over communicate any of this, right? That would be the other thing I'd lead with.
Totally. I agree. I think from a territory perspective, every company, or most companies of a certain size anyway, will have different setups. They'll have enterprise account reps, maybe strategic reps. And in both those cases, there's usually a named model, meaning you own the entire family tree. And so in those cases, you want to make sure that even if there's a subsidiary that you haven't done business with, it's probably owned by that business. And the reason being is that what they're trying to do is strategically create a enterprise sale, an enterprise deal where you're selling to everyone, right? Because you can maximize how much you're selling for, you can give preferred pricing to the vendor, so it works for everyone. But where it breaks down is that when there's that subsidiary you didn't realize was part of the overall business, and somebody in inside sales goes to sell for them. So you need to make that super clear. Whereas then if you go down the tree to smaller businesses that may still be part of an overall parent company, it may become less important. It may represent less value or not, depending on your business, but it can still be very important to at least have that visibility that Scott talked about. Because now at least you know that there's two people selling into this overall business, and they can talk to each other. They can strategize together. So it becomes important, but like Scott said, communicate, have your rules of engagement clearly articulated, and make sure everyone's aware of it. It's not going to stop the complaining by any means. And I've done a couple sessions with.
It's like if you could figure out how to stop the complaining, that'd be great.
Oh my goodness, we'd all be happy. Yeah. I've done a couple of sessions with Matt Wester from Capato, and he says, that you want to articulate those. It's not going to stop the complaining, but at least it's very clear. You can say, hey, at the beginning of the year, this is what we rolled out and you agreed to it. They actually have them sign to say you agree to this, so that later when you do run into these problems, and you will, there's always going to be exceptions to every rule, that at least you can shut down the conversation pretty quickly and have everyone on board.
So Molly, in chat, Michelle and Helen talked about the account creation process, right? And that's just as important, right, as cleaning up everything, right? Because we did a project, and the first project we called was the path to 100. How do you get the data so that everybody feels like it's 100% clean? But just as important to that project was a project we called the path to forever. How do you keep it evergreen, right? Yeah. And Michelle, your question on account creation, right, is a challenging one. And we've gone back and forth, right? Like everyone would love an army of people that, from a sales ops perspective, checks everything and gives you 100% confidence. But most companies can't afford that. And so what we've done is we've partnered with companies like Traction, that when an account gets created, you can create rules, right? If it meets this criteria, it is automatically created. And if it doesn't meet that criteria, then it goes to a team for review, right? So that way it's not slowing down the process. But to your point, you always have to have that check no matter what, whether it is upfront in the process, whether it's an after the fact process, right? You've got to do what you can. Again, as practitioners inside of sales ops, we all want the control earlier in the process. Sales wants to be able to do whatever they want. So, there's different ways around that. But however you can find to automate enriching that data with third-party data upon creation, that's really the key, right? And if you can find that, then you can use a hierarchy tool, right? Like Dave has, or like anybody has, right? That'll allow you then to put that in, and you can build rules around that.
And additionally, with like the deduplication, right? Like you want that enrichment, you want that, let's bring it together so we can analyze it against what we currently have and make those systematic decisions from there, from a merge standpoint or a prevention standpoint. Additionally to like the enrichment piece, there's on creation enrichment, and then there's ongoing enrichment, right? Data's fluid, data's constantly changing. So really making sure that you don't think of your data as stale, and make sure you have that, evergreen enrichment that's happening on the right frequency and the right cadence. And Dave, sorry, I cut you off. I know you had a comment to add, so hopefully you kept it.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree with you, Molly, about the ongoing enrichment to make sure it's not getting stale or decaying. But yeah, just going back a step, if you were to ask what's my recommendation on whether you do the upfront or after the fact cleanup, I'm a huge advocate of speed, right? Not to slow down sales. Let your sales rep run as fast as they can, right? They are going to make a mess, but you're going to get more sales as a result. And that does mean doing the cleanup afterwards, but that as a result, you should get more sales. Now, I also recognize that public companies have a bigger struggle with this because yes, they want faster sales, but they also auditing and governance around it. And so they are usually the ones that have to do the upfront confirmation that accounts should be created versus going and cleaning it up afterwards. But like Scott said, if you can have the best of both worlds, that's ideal, where certain situations you're automatically creating accounts and others you're going through that governance or approval process or cleanup after the fact, the stewardship later.
Yeah, and Mark asked, what are some of the criteria, right? If it's an account that we could find, right, through third-party data that isn't a customer, well, then I'll go allow that, right? Because I want to get time to revenue. If it is an account that we can find that isn't a current customer and or doesn't have a current opportunity, we'd allow those. Or maybe we would only allow an opportunity to be created under the existing count shell, so we don't have it, right? Really, where our criteria would come in is if that was an existing biller, right? Then that would be an automatic stop. And you just got to think about what is your tolerance. What is your tolerance and what is your strategy about creating accounts? So what do you care about most? Do you care most about not having conflict at existing customers? Do you care most about not creating any type of duplicates, right? So there's different ways there. But we always kind of created a fast pass for certain things. And if we couldn't find it, then the answer is that would not create a fast pass, right? Because you don't want to encourage reps to be creative, enough so that the third-party system wouldn't find it. I had that struggle once, and that is not a. You want sales reps to be creative. That's not where you want them to be creative, right? So anything that we could not find externally automatically had to come for someone to review, so that you kept up a certain level of data integrity.
I love that. Yeah, reps can be creative, particularly when there's a vested interest in making it accounts that would end up coming to them, or maybe it shouldn't be.
The other thing is to think about what is the intake that you need on account creation, right? So like instead of just being able to create an account and providing, name, right? What are the additional attributes that you need to make sure like your reps are bringing in so you can properly match, properly manage, and like prove that there's some level of, validity to that account.
You got it, Molly. And by the way, Mark said it again, right? Some people do it through a lead convert process, right? We put a process in place where before that lead could be converted into account, that's where we inserted governance. Other people just do it based on the account, right? So you can use some Salesforce technology as well. The benefit we found to doing it as a lead is if it already existed, you can convert that lead into an opportunity versus an account. So that way you don't have to go through a duplication process.
Totally.
Perfect. So a couple other kind of questions to think about here, right? So you're on the call, you're listening in, you're saying, I feel like there is a need that we look at our account hierarchy infrastructure, based on what I know about our business strategy. You're going to talk to your boss, right? So we're ops professionals, talk to our boss to make this business case. What would you say? What have you said, Scott? Obviously, you've probably had these conversations time and time again. What have you said that worked, and what have you said that didn't work?
That's a great question. So again, we started off talking about different angles that you can go at, right? Whether it's churn, whether it is revenue, increasing revenue, whether it's increasing sales, whether it is, unfortunately, in this time and place, right, reducing OpEx, through staffing reductions and automation, right? There's a bunch of different paths that you can go down. But I tend to be of the mindset that you got to paint the complete picture, and it can't be just one, because it really does have an impact on your total business. As you think about creating that justification, very rarely do you work with a company that won't help you do that, right? So I would say engage with a couple of people, right, to have that conversation, because you'll never be able to create that business case up front, right? But it is worth absolutely having that conversation. Now, if you need to go have a conversation with your boss to say, hey, let's go engage this together, right? Then you got to really think of what are the pain points that your unique business is solving for, right? And how do you tie that back to a priority? Because it is true, right? To Dave's point, there are certain organizations where it doesn't matter, right? But if you're in an enterprise world, then it does matter, and you're going to be able to find a way to tie it back to your organizational priorities.
Totally. Yeah, and I'd add to that, I'd say usually falls into a couple buckets. One is cost savings for time spent, right? A lot of time your ops team is spending way more time than they should be trying to either clean up data or make it visible or build something to automate that they then run into struggles on that you can save that time on. But the one that usually moves the needle a lot quicker or easier is potential revenue, right? That you're leaving a ton of revenue on the table without being able to see exactly what you've sold and what you haven't to which of the businesses in this enterprise. If you're paying for enterprise reps, they're usually making more, their quotas are higher and their commissions are higher as a result. So you want them to be able to have the best chance to grow these businesses, right? That's how you're really going to make some money. So usually that even if you can make one additional sale, that you can pay for any solution in and of itself, but that ideally you're having every single enterprise rep be able to make additional sales as a result. And that usually is the best way to articulate the ROI. And yet in some organizations, they may look at cost cutting right now. And so it's a way of trying to reduce the amount of money you're spending on reps who aren't hitting their quota versus those reps that are blowing their quotas out of the water, right? So those reps that are hitting accelerators, they're paying a ton of money to, and then there's others not. So this is a way of more evenly balancing that, or giving you some insight into what should the quotas be for these enterprises based on the penetration you've had so far and the potential that you have out there, as well as rebalancing territories to give these enterprises to other people so that now you can have an even shot across those. So there's a few ways to articulate it.
And Dave, even, again, understanding from the sales reps where the time sucks are, right? Because to your point, even if let's pretend you can't make that argument that, hey, this will help me sell more with our current customers, which I think you will be able to make that argument quite convincingly. And that's been our experience. But even if you can't make that argument, the amount of time that the sales reps are spending on issues that could be solved by this, right, could be spent driving additional new logo business, right? That is a really powerful conversation to any CRO or
Totally.
CFO.
Commission
Absolutely.
splits. Yeah, exactly as well.
So we've talked a lot about account hierarchies from the sales benefit perspective. Really would be curious on perspective of like, how is marketing or growth benefited from kind of having this data infrastructure? Same thing with customer success and partnership. So Scott, any perspective from just how you've seen this implemented in organizations that you've been with and kind of that cross-functional go-to-market benefit?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, from a marketing perspective, we could probably spend 3 hours talking about the importance of it, right? And so I think no further back than just this week, right? We are doing a targeted campaign, and again, the ability to understand, given market data, who our customers are, who our customers aren't, what locations they do business in today versus what business they could do business with us in tomorrow, right? That becomes really important, right? That's how you do targeted marketing, targeted campaigns. At the same point in time, from a customer success perspective, being able to have that single pane of glass and to be able to pull together reports for your customers. The number of customer success professionals who will consistently say, I spend all day trying to find this account and this account and this account and put all these reports together, right? When you have one of the important things is when you create a hierarchy, it's really important to do it in the sales system. But where the key value is making sure that then propagates throughout all the other systems, because that's where you then really start to see organizational change, right? That's where your service delivery and your customer success can really feel it. You know, another example that I've heard a lot of and that we've seen a lot of is differentiated levels of service from a repair perspective, right? In many companies, depending on how big you are, you get differentiated levels of service. Sometimes it's onshore, sometimes it's offshore, right? And the number of Fortune 500 companies that have complained to say, hey, I'm having a subpar experience and I'm being sent offshore, and contractually, I might have an SLA to do it onshore, right? Again, that is something where a powerful hierarchy that is propagated throughout all the systems can make a dramatic impact, and again, can have quantifiable impact as well.
And when you think about, Dave, did you have anything to add there? Sorry, before I...
Sure. Yeah. A couple quick things. So when I think about marketing first, arguably marketing's job is to try and generate interest in your business, your products or solutions. And by a lot of times by telling stories, and what better way to do it than recognizing from this overall business who has purchased and who hasn't, and going and targeting the people who hasn't, so that you can tell that story that's going to hit home a lot harder because someone in the business is already purchasing. But today, a lot more companies are doing account-based marketing. And when you're going through that account-based marketing, you first want to figure out, well, who are the people that we have in our database that we can go after? And when it's part of an overall enterprise, it's important to make sure that you're taking into consideration all the subsidiaries as well. But that's not easy to do unless, of course, you've already sorted out your hierarchies so you can figure out all the people that are there. So really important for marketing, and can be very, very effective, as well as then being able to recognize and have marketing attribution. If someone comes in from a subsidiary that they were going after, that you want marketing to get credit for that too. But yeah, on the customer success side, one struggle that we hear a lot of is particularly any software companies that are selling into an enterprise, but that those licenses, or it could be hardware as well, are being deployed to subsidiaries. They don't necessarily know who has it, who has access right now, and who should have access. Usually it's bound in a contract somewhere that someone has to go read, but then there's no easy way to go and deploy it. But that if you have your hierarchies set up and you can kind of assign or allocate those assets a lot easier, it's going to make everyone's lives better, and they can just quickly see who should have ownership, who does have ownership today, and where have things not been allocated so far.
And when you look at that, are you doing more like aggregations or roll-ups like at different levels of the accounts within CRM? Sorry, I'm going to take us like super tactical now, but just really curious for my own perspective, you know, how you're aggregating data throughout the hierarchies, and like being able to properly report and then move that actionability.
That's one of the struggles that I think the native parent account field in Salesforce really has, because what happens a lot of times is people have either tried to do it manually where they're linking through that parent account field, but that reporting can really only be done at one level unless you've created some crazy formula field that can crawl its way up. But that others have tried to automate systems where they'll create custom Apex, or they'll create a process builder flow or a flow to link accounts together. And two problems arise there. One of two: you're either making a decision to just link to the parent if it exists, and then if you're missing a level, you've now got 2 or 3 or multiple hierarchies for the same business, so you've separated them unknowingly, or that you decide to fill in that missing gap by creating a record automatically, which sounds like a good solution. But when you do that automatically and you have hundreds of thousands, or like Scott said, millions of records in your CRM, you could all of a sudden create thousands or hundreds of thousands of blank records, just bloating your environment, causing the problem Scott said at the beginning, where reps now can no longer find anything. So in either case, you're going to have to struggle with that reporting. And so what we recommend is to be able to link those together, either using a tool like ourselves or building one that you now have some sort of identifier to be able to report on the entire tree. And what we do specifically is we actually create a custom record, a complete company record, we call it, where now all of a sudden all of the records that are part of this business are put into this complete company so that you can report across it. So you can tell what's the total ARR, what is the MRR, whatever the metrics are that are important to your business. And you can do things that also affect your territory. So what's the max level of employees? And that's a big one for situations like holdings companies, like a Berkshire Hathaway, where the top level says it has like 25 employees. Meanwhile, they have hundreds of thousands. And so you want the max level to be able to tell, hey, this is an enterprise, so we should assign it to the enterprise teams instead of going to an SMB in that case, where they own one of the biggest companies on the planet. So that's one thing we'd certainly recommend, is using that custom object to try and aggregate.
No, that's super helpful and ties well to the question we just got. So I was even ahead of the game on that. And then Jillian just asked a question, how long does it on average take to clean, fix, and like actually structure the hierarchy data? What is the average timeline you're seeing? I know it probably varies based on company size and amount of accounts, but what's kind of the general average?
Dave, I'm curious to your thought. I've done this in a couple of companies. When it's millions of records, it's not weeks. It's more like months and more like over a year, right? And it is a journey and an investment. What I'd say is, if it was easy to do, it would have been done a long time ago, right? So it is an investment in priority and in people as you do it. Now, again, it all depends on how big of an organization you are. But again, I'd encourage you, and you can steal my patent pending path to 100, path to forever, right? But you need to be able to look about both of those. It's wonderful and good if you can clean it up, but if you don't fix the underlying processes and root causes, your legacy will be gone within a year, and you'll be right back to where you started.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, we'd recommend to everyone to do a crawl, walk, run approach, right? Don't try to boil the ocean to begin with, because you want to get better as you go, versus never getting better because you want to be perfect from the beginning. So the way you start is first going through, like Scott said, your definition of an account, but that if you can immediately set some automation up so you can link accounts together so you can at least see it. You may not want to deploy that and make it visible to your reps yet, because sometimes they'll get frustrated if it doesn't adhere to your territories and whatnot. So make it visible just internally to sales operations or data governance, whatnot, so that you can go and validate it, and start based on revenue. Which are the companies that represent the most money to your business? Start there first and then work your way down, because that's going to allow you and give you the best opportunities for making more money and being super accurate. The lower down you get, the less important, and you can clean that up over time. But that's at least going to allow you to get something out really, really quickly. Strategic accounts first kind of thing. And then work your way down the list without never accomplishing anything because you're trying to boil the ocean.
One of the things we did, Dave, right? We tried to do the easy stuff, the no-brainers, the easy button, right? And then we did the, okay, where can a sales ops centralized resource go in and look at something and insert intelligence? And then after that, sometimes you really just need the field, right? The field understands it, they see it, they look at it. And so we created a structured process, again, like Dave said, first looking at by revenue, right? But the more you can get that input, and there are natural groupings inside of your organization, whether it's by CSM or whether it's by sales rep or something, that'll give you more and more intelligence, and someone else who is closer to it can say, oh yeah, it's this, right? But again, in the long list of things, getting their feedback is important, but it kind of is at the end. But that's how you go from 80% to 95%. That's not how you go from 0 to 80.
And then in terms of, so now, we've hit the state, we've got our crawl, walk, run, we're running, we're adapted, we're, everything is going well. How often are you updating the data, right? What's your recommendation for kind of the frequency of updates and kind of continuing to manage the hierarchies?
The world changes every day.
Yeah.
Right, would be my first answer. Now, you're not going to do things every day, but I think it is important to work with a provider, right? To Fabian's very first question, we worked with a third-party data provider. We've used Dun & Bradstreet, and they've been wonderful partners. And so we make sure in Salesforce, we're getting updates on a monthly basis, right? And then we create audits and checks to take those changes, to figure out whether or not we want to accept the changes, and if we do accept the changes, then to make that right. It's all part of that robust governance process. But you don't want to do it annually. One of the things I might suggest is you make sure you're taking in the data and you're processing it on a monthly basis. You might not want to make account changes based on that until a semi-annual or an annual basis, right? To avoid conflict in the field. Because if you're changing account assignments on a sales rep every week, right, it's just going to cause consternation and it's not worth it, right? So you kind of do that annual resegmentation process.
Or at the when you're going to redo quotas and look through that, so you've got the aligned book of business, especially as mergers or acquisitions happen within data sets.
I totally agree with Scott that I'm a big advocate of updating people's awareness as soon as it happens, as soon as you know. And yes, Dun & Bradstreet's fantastic. If you have their subscription to what used to be Optimizer and now is DB Connect, it'll update it automatically, but not to reassign that territory as a result. So to make sure that in that contract we talked about at the beginning, your rules of engagement, that we're going to update the data so you're aware of it, but that we're not going to reassign ownership until the end of the year. So why I want to let people know is a lot of times there's mergers and acquisitions, right? Maybe less this year with the economy than there was last year, but prior to this year, they were happening constantly. And you want people to know because it can affect that, wow, that sale disappeared, or this represents a much bigger deal or more cross-sell and whatnot. But like Scott said, if you're reassigning the territories automatically, you're just going to frustrate people and it's going to cause a lot of inefficiency.
Just going to create more work for RevOps at the end of the day because
we're
just getting more questions, right? And arguments and all of the fun things there. So I know we're wrapping up on time. Audience engagement's been great. If you have other questions, please make sure you drop them in the chat so we can try to address them in our last few minutes or so. But Scott, Dave, anything else you want to share, right, that we didn't have a chance to touch on? Any other pieces of wisdom or lessons learned or best practices that we just didn't address?
One that comes to mind is a large topic of conversation around hierarchies is your territories, right? When you're going through territory planning, you're trying to balance your territories to make everyone's shot easier or to make everyone's potential the same to sell. And that almost always those account conflicts come from your hierarchy structure. And so to make sure you have that set up and in place prior to doing your territories, but that, as Scott said, it can take a while. So you may want to start that early before you start the territory process so that you're all set there once you get into territory carving and whatnot. And then I think the last thing I'd say, sorry, Scott, before I cut you off, Mark, I saw in a comment asking for a demo. Yeah, unfortunately, we wanted to hear from Scott, the expert here. So didn't have time for demo, but happy to do that anytime. If you want to reach out over LinkedIn, just message me that you saw the webinar and happy to chat.
So you know what I think I'll end with. So we've been partners with Dave for many years and really appreciate everything that they've done. You know, at the end of the day, one of the biggest takeaways is you can't over communicate, right? Sales absolutely has a very short attention span, and I say it with love. I would say it to their face. And so they're constantly forgetting what value it is. And so whether it is, hey, this sales rep is constantly complaining about trying to find all this data, or they're constantly complaining that, you know, Johnny's in their territory, or they're constantly saying marketing doesn't find any opportunities, right? Whatever that is, making sure that you're emphasizing how it is getting better, and what does the account hierarchy provide in terms of added intelligence. And so finding a rep or a director who can understand that and can create that compelling event, and making sure that you've got an advocate outside of sales ops is really, really important. And then just overly communicating as you're doing that, making sure that it's part of, not only the full infrastructure, but start to finish from a sales rep perspective, from a training perspective, right? That they're constantly learning how this can help them.
Absolutely. Really appreciate both of your times today. And Scott, just thank you for sharing all of your relevant and experience throughout the years. And sounds like you are the expert in account hierarchies. So have really appreciated your wisdom and what you've learned along the way. One of the things I want to share is that Traction will be sending out an email with their RevOps guide on how to accelerate revenue with account hierarchies. I know that was kind of a lot of the comments in the chat was what additional resources are there out there. So they've got a great ebook that they'll be sharing too. And then I know that they've posted some links for additional resources as well, specifically around speed to lead and duplicates. So make sure you check those out, but really appreciate it. And this has been a great conversation. So thank you both.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much, Molly.
Take care.
Bye now.